You're listening to 91.7 FM, WSUW, in Whitewater, Wisconsin. Let me spin you a tale. Imagine a country so vast, it covers 12 different time zones. A country rich in oil, gas, and timber. Yet a country that imports everything else, including gasoline. A country where value of money depends on the price of a barrel of oil. A country ruled by its security agency, where those objecting get sent to prison, shot, and poisoned. A country where TV battles the refrigerator. A country where people can't decide what is worse, to stay silent or to speak up. A country where George Orwell's 1984 is a bestseller. Now imagine you live there. You're listening to Rashkin Report. You're listening to 91.7 FM, The Edge in Whitewater, Wisconsin. This is Rashkin Report, and I'm your host, Yuri Rashkin. Today's program is going to be different in yet another way. It feels like as the season one is progressing, I am turning up the complexity of the challenges that I put in front of me in order to deliver the program to you, the listener. And what we're going to be listening to today is part one of my conversation with SASHA Sotnik of Sotnik TV. So let me tell you a little bit about this. Basically, SASHA Sotnik is an independent journalist in Moscow who conducts interviews with his guests who are maybe opposition figures or figures who are just in opposition to government. And he speaks very strongly against the government, and so do his guests. And that's kind of part one of his show. The other part of his show is that he goes out on the streets and he interviews people. And he asks some questions, and he just, I guess, gently pesters them for some kind of answers. And he gets, it seems like more and more, quite a few. Although it's never easy to get people on the streets of Moscow to respond, even dishonestly, even insincerely, even in a pretend voice, even broadcasting the television's talking points. But it's difficult to get people to respond, and yet SASHA Sotnik consistently is able to do so. He has a kind of a manner of a maybe even a TV news broadcaster or TV news journalist. Except it turns out that his education is in musical theory and then in acting. So, and he really wanted to be an author, but it turned out that he is a tremendously popular independent journalist with over 100,000 subscribers on YouTube, and many people who are watching every one of his episodes that usually vary in length between 5 and 15 minutes. The interesting thing about this particular interview is that we really went in depth discussing the Russian media landscape, because for me this is such an amazing opportunity, to be quite honest with you, to speak with somebody who is a real media figure in Russia, and as somebody who's been observing Russian media for several years. I find it very interesting, just incredible to be able to talk to one of the people that I watch on a regular basis, and to bring this conversation to you as well. So I asked questions that were fairly in depth, and I'm not sure if they're going to be classified as inside baseball, but they certainly spoke about the things that are happening in Russia, and in referencing some specific names that many Americans, or I would even say most Americans, wouldn't have a clue about. So I decided to take the interview with SASHA Sotnik and split it up into two parts. And because the interview is about 50 minutes, and what we're going to do is, on this week's program, we're going to have the first 35 minutes, and then on the next week's program, we're going to have the second 25 minutes. Perhaps there will be other things that will be happening next week, as next week will be officially the end of the season 1 for Rashkin Report on WSU W91.7 FM, The Edge in Whitewater, Wisconsin. And I couldn't be more proud of what's been accomplished during the first season, the kinds of guests, the kind of conversations that I've been able to bring to you, and I'm hoping that in the summer perhaps there will be some special episodes, and then in the fall we'll return with season 2 of Rashkin Report, and we'll be looking for some interesting and unique guests to bring to you. After all, it is rather unusual to find a program that's dedicated to one topic such as this and have guests of consistently high level, and I'm very proud to have been able to bring this to you. Now, with Mr. Sotnik, the conversation had so many specific names that what I'm going to do for the rest of the program, before we get to the actual conversation with my guest, is I'm going to go through some things that names and different places that Mr. Sotnik references and we reference in the conversation, and do kind of a preview. If you remember, there was a comedian, Dennis Miller, and for a few years Mr. Dennis Miller was one of the co-hosts for Monday Night Football. And Mr. Miller is known for kind of a maybe even nerdy humor, and so that somebody who's very educated or knows a lot of things about a lot of things. He would throw out these references, obscure references, during Monday Night Football. And then what I thought was the most interesting part about it is that the next day there was a blog that was running on ABC News that specifically dealt with explaining to people what were the obscure references that Mr. Miller was making the night before. So what I'd like to do next is to take a look at some of these obscure references that are going to be made, that have been made throughout my conversation with my upcoming guests. And rather than first have you listen to the conversation, then explain what happened, I'm going to try to go the other way and to talk about what will be in the conversation, and give you a little bit of a preview. I will specify that I am in no way complete book of knowledge on all things Russian, but I do have some idea that I wanted to share with you. So first, here we go. The first thing that I think that we reference in every conversation that would be important to explain is apartment building explosions. Mr. Sotnik talks about this fairly early in the conversation. The thing there is that during 1999-2000, there was some explosions in apartment buildings in Moscow that were blamed on Chechen separatists, and this actually led to the wars in Chechnya. But it turned out that, well, not turned out, but there's at least reasonable amount of suspicion that those apartment buildings were actually explosions were instigated by KGB in order to promote an environment where people would be more likely to accept Putin as their leader. And that's been a very common theory that's been accepted by many Russian people. Next, Mr. Sotnik talks about his new books that are coming out, and he compares himself, or he says that his writing style has been compared to such people as Dovlatov and Yerofeev. Dovlatov was a Russian writer who is one of the most famous modern Russian writers. He actually immigrated to the United States and died in the United States, I believe, of a heart attack, and he was in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, and we're talking about 1980s. So very modern, very kind of everyday, common language. I would say maybe something along the lines of J.D. Salinger, or Kurt Vonnegut, somebody who is very easy to read. It's not a complicated style. Yerofeev, on the other hand, is in particularly famous for his book of these thoughts by an alcoholic as he travels on a train from Moscow to his village nearby. And so also a very accessible writing style. So that's a next writer there. Academic Ryzhov Academic Ryzhov is one of the most well-known people in Russia. He was born in 1930, and he started out as a scientist dealing with rockets, which was obviously a popular idea in Soviet Union, dealing with weapons. And then he moved into politics, was in State Duma in 89, 90. Of course, it was called differently, but he was part of the Soviet Congress, and he repeatedly turned down a position of prime minister when Yeltsin was in power, was eventually ambassador of Russia to France, and has been active in different organizations defending the rights of scientists, and as a well-known human rights activist, essentially, but also one of the most respected elders in Russia today. So that's Academic Ryzhov, and SASHA SOTNIK speaks of the deep sense of honor that he felt being able to speak with people like him. Then we have Solovyev, Kiselyov, and Tolstoy. Solovyev, Kiselyov, and Tolstoy are three propaganda men who are something along the lines of Bill O'Reilly, type of host that hosts their different genres. One is a nightly panel show, the other one is a weekly show, and the other one is a daytime talk show, but they're all essentially representing the point of view of not just government, but very aggressive form of propaganda. And this is what people in Russia are able to watch on their federal government state-run TV, are those types of hosts. Next, Sasha references the program Vzгляд, which was a weekend, as I recall, or weeknight, but it was a once a week TV program in the 90s. That was one of the most kind of free-thinking, and the fact that there was an NTV, which is independent TV station, that was eventually actually absorbed by Russian government, is now considered one of the nastiest actually programs that has released some of these. There's been a couple of these documentaries, investigative pieces that have been basically attacks against opposition figures in Russia, with these slapped together accusations that were, some of them were more obvious because they were just dates that were not matching up on different things, and they were accusing some leaders of opposition of being spies of the United States, and others that were accusing opposition figures to actually colluding against each other, and and that was all on a channel that used to be considered a standard for independent television and flagship of independent television in Russia. That NTV that Sasha Sotnik references, that is gone, of course, and that's been gone. It's been in government hands since early 2000s. And has been actually referenced by several of Rashkin Report guests in the past as a kind of a important moment in Russian media history. Now, there is this channel called Dozhd, which translates in English as Rain TV, and it's a little bit of just a lighter version. It's not necessarily any kind of a sort of a protest channel, but it's just something that is less than total propaganda, and it delivers kind of ongoing information for people with entertainment, arts and entertainment, They also rebroadcast TED Talks translated in Russian, so by just not openly rejecting Western influence, they already appear to be pro-Western. Interestingly enough, this channel Dozhd was pushed off TV and cable, and now it exists as an internet TV channel, and you can buy a subscription for an amount that the less as the ruble is worth less and less. The subscription to the channel is also decreasing due to the exchange rate, but roughly for about $7 or $8 a month, you can be a subscriber to Dozhd and have access to their programming 24/7. Sasha, though, claims that Dozhd, which makes sense, is not a fully independent channel, and there are areas which they are not allowed to cross, and there are lines they're not allowed to cross. Next, there's Radio Liberty, and that is a project of Radio Freedom, or also known as Radio Liberty, is an international non-commercial broadcasting organization that's financed by United States Congress through different forms and so on. Broadcast, they actually in 28 different languages and for 23 countries of Eastern Europe, of Central Asia, Near and Far East. And besides they broadcasting on radio, they're also broadcasting on the internet, which is really where Russian independent media exists at this point. So Sasha makes a reference to Radio Liberty, although briefly. Then he talks about Posner. Vladimir Posner is another interesting person in Russian media landscape. Mr. Posner comes from a international family, and he speaks English as a first language, but he's been back in Russia for many, many years. Regularly you can see him on channels such as CNN promoting Kremlin's point of view, but he is a long-established host on Russian television, and Sasha refers to him as a predator fox, somebody who is being sneaky but perhaps a little more dangerous than he appears. Next, Sasha Sotnik references Zhvanetsky, who is a legendary Russian comedian, humorist. He is a writer of hilarious and poignant satire, but the reference in this case is very simply to an expression, maybe a two-liner, one-liner by Zhvanetsky, where he's referencing a person who says that he was beating his head on the wall, and so obviously somebody was hurting themselves. But the conclusion that the person comes to is that, well, he basically got away from answering the question. So that's kind of different ways of avoiding answering the questions. That would be the most painful one of the more painful ones, I suppose. And next, Sasha Sotnik references Beria. Beria was Stalin's Secretary of Interior, one of the people that was operating the mechanism of mass repressions, really the person responsible for mass repressions, person who was managing the operation of the archipelago Gulag, the concentration camps, day to day, so to say, making sure that they were full. He was hoping to become the next leader of Soviet Union following Stalin's death, but instead he was pretty quickly arrested and executed by other Politburo members who were afraid that if they didn't get rid of him, he would get rid of them quickly. And this is 1953-54 we're talking about. So that's a different mess that we can always get into later. Then there's Leah Akhidjakova, which is another guest that Sasha Sotnik references of his. She's a famous actress who dared to speak against Kremlin's point of view and has been considered an enemy of the state or national traitor or something like that, even though she's most harmless-looking female and is a legendary Russian actress that is known from some very classic films over the last 30, 40, 50 years. Next is Professor Zubov, who is just one of those intellectual thought leaders that Sasha Sotnik gets to interview. Moskvaretsky Most is the bridge. Moskvaretsky Bridge is where Boris Nemtsov was murdered. Boris Nemtsov is a figure that is going to be coming up in conversations on Rashkin Report pretty much permanently. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to speak with him prior to his assassination because, well, this program didn't exist. And so there was no reason to connect with him, and who knew? But he was most influential and person of most consequence in Russian politics. He was murdered a year ago, literally across the street from Kremlin on a bridge that sooner or later is going to carry his name. Next was Lev Schlossberg, who is a Russian politician and in fact was a recent guest on Rashkin Report. He had a very interesting story of his own, and to which you can listen to by listening to one of our prior episodes. You can find all of Rashkin Report episodes on YouTube in Russian and in English whenever appropriate and whenever feasible. So I encourage you to check out conversation with Mr. Schlossberg. Then Mr. Nemtsov himself, Sasha goes a little bit of length explaining his relationship with Mr. Nemtsov. Mr. Navalny is perhaps the most known opposition leader in Russia today. He unsuccessfully ran for mayor of Moscow a few years ago and got way more votes than government anticipated, and ever since then he has been under constant oppression, a kind of a regular attack, so to say, and in fact his brother is currently serving a sentence, a 3-year sentence, which is being usually referenced as the regime's passion and affinity for taking hostages. So rather than arresting the opposition leader, they arrest his brother to assure that the one that remains free isn't going to behave. Next we have Mr. Chaika, who is a prosecutor general in Russia and who's been accused of being basically running an empire of corruption and gangsters that is headed by his sons. Echo of Moscow is a Russian version of, I don't know, whether the CNN or whatever news. It was the first independent news radio station that appeared during the collapse of Soviet Union, and it's been around ever since. Mr. Maltsev is another independent broadcaster who has quite a following. Perhaps we'll be able to speak with him in the future. Mr. Venediktov is the editor-in-chief of Echo of Moscow, and a person that is as big as the station. He's got a very distinct style. People know what he looks like. He's got this kind of bushy old white hair. He looks like maybe a hedgehog or something, and actually he's compared to a mole. Piantkovsky is another thought leader that is a regular guest on SASHA Sotnik's program, very critical of Putin and a very well-known person in Russia. Currently living in Israel, he made some statements that were considered to be calling for the separation of the country, and that's a crime. Calling for breakup of Russia. And so Mr. Piantkovsky moved to Israel and lives there. Miss Ryabtseva, Lesi Ryabtseva, was a mid-20s assistant, the lady who rapidly rose through Echo of Moscow ranks, and while she was interesting personality, was certainly surprisingly ignorant and aggressive. Was eventually exposed in her ignorance when the next person, Mr. SASHA Sotnik references, Mr. Shenderovich, who was a guest on Echo of Moscow and was interviewed by Ms. Lesi Ryabtseva. Ms. Lesi Ryabtseva said that the population of Russia was 8 million people. Mr. Shenderovich hung on to that and wrote that joke all the way home, because of course population of Russia is about 24 million people. And we will continue discussing what we don't cover today. We'll cover next week. But so there is Ms. Ryabtseva, then we have Mr. Shenderovich, who is a person who exposed Lesi Ryabtseva, but also another legendary figure in Russian humor and satire, and is currently announced to be one of the most dangerous people in Russia because of his satire against Putin. On that note, why don't we take a short break and begin our conversation with Mr. SASHA Sotnik. Remember that all of the episodes are available on YouTube, so you can listen to it again and make sure you understand what happened. But I think that the broad storyline is pretty clear. Thank you so much for listening to Rashkin Report. I'm your host, Yuri Rashkin, and you're listening to 91.7 FM, WSUW, The Edge, here in Whitewater, Wisconsin. We'll be right back. You're listening to 91.7 FM, WSUW, in Whitewater, Wisconsin. listening to Rashkin Report. SASHA Sotnik, welcome to Rashkin Report. I'll begin with a question. What I see on YouTube is a person who fearlessly goes out on the street, who goes to his guests' apartments, who films conversations with his guests out on the street, and yet you're viewed by tens of thousands or hundreds, if not millions of people. Could you talk a little bit about how you got to this lifestyle? Well, I'll say step by step. I got to this. It was clear to me, starting in 1999, when I first saw Mr. Putin, that everything would be very bad. Following explosions in apartment buildings, I had suspicions. And then I understood that it really was. All of these 16 years, while Mr. Putin's been in power, I've been in hardcore opposition to the government and the system. I mean, I've been in opposition to this system from before, but now especially hardcore. If you're interested, especially in the video, when I started doing it, I had a project prior to Sotnik TV, which is less known, and it is one businessman met with me who wished to remain unnamed, anonymous, and said that if I will undertake realization of a video project about what is going on in the country, that he will help me financially. This was a very timely help, a very good help, thanks to which I was able to obtain for this project. I was able to get equipment, the editing equipment, lights, basically everything that I needed. Not the extras, but the most basic necessities, yes. Microphone, this cube, so that I could professionally work. And we began working. Then my path with the cameraman and with a business person, unfortunately, also have parted, but I decided to, considering the experience that I have gained over 2 years or more, I decided not to drop this and to turn all my experience, my passion, knowledge into this project, Sotnik TV. Didn't want to name it with my name for a long time, but my friends, marketers, persuaded me that would be the best way out. The recognition, and especially since we have our own logo. And now for almost 2 years, well, close to 2 years, we're working from zero, decided to do this project Sotnik TV, and over this 2 years we have over 100,000 subscribers on YouTube, and a lot of materials that are people watching all over the world. People are really interested, they want to know what's going on in Russia, they want to know, they want to see, not soaped up, with a clear eye. They want to see independent reports of an independent journalist. There's much in demand. Unfortunately, there's very little of it in Russian information field, and so to talk about any sort of competition doesn't even make sense. As far as heroism, of course there's no heroism. This is just everyday stuff. Maybe I'm just used to it. Over 4 years of doing this. Still, the project is developing, and I think will continue to develop. You're a journalist by education? No. I have 2 educations. Music theory, most of which I've probably forgotten by now, and acting department of Chelyabinsk Musical College. I was studying with such famous names, Chelyabinsk University. Yes. I had Professor Orlov and Professor Simonov. Yeah, so that's how. But I gotta say that from my youth I've been interested in literature, and I've been writing a lot, very much. And finally, then I was working in in a show business, but that was a very brief period of time. Then in some advertising agencies was writing stories and copywriters and doing some corporate work. In 2006, I was invited to lead a publishing house of Russian modern prose back then. That was needed, although with every month less and less so. In 2009, the publishing house completed its existence for obvious reasons, crisis and so on. And starting 2011, I've been, since April of 2012, I've been doing what I'm doing now. So in some way, following a Russian expression, a wolf is being fed by his feet. That's true, yes. When people ask me what I would like to do, of course I'd want to write. I want to write books. But it turned out that the journalism is stealing from the writer time and energy and years. And now I will have 2 books coming out. In fact, yesterday I received 40 copies, and soon there'll be a presentation of these 2 books. It's ironic prose. It's really what I want to do, but I have to do this. I usually say that, unfortunately, circumstances, thanks to Putin for this, forced me to come down from the heavens of prose to the hell of journalism. You're not alone in this, because many of my guests who are maybe teaching in different universities, they see this blooming of interest towards Russia, especially starting in 2009 and definitely in the last 2 years. So in this sense, very much sense to Mr. Putin that he made the world, of course, perhaps not in the way that it should have been except for Mr. Putin, but he made people interested in Russia. Sasha, then tell us about your books. Let's do a little, as they say, preview. What are the books? Well, it's ironic prose. It's fiction. Ironic fiction. It's hard for me to talk about it because these are... Some compare it with Dovlatov, some others compare it with Yerofeev. I wouldn't want to be compared to anything because I'm not imitating anyone, neither in my reports nor in my writing. I try to be myself. How it comes out, that's how it comes out. So perhaps you can say that you are not, who are you not like at all? Oh, I don't think it's like anyone. That's what I think. And as far as Putin made a lot of people, forced people to do good things, you're absolutely right there. In fact, when I meet with some interesting and wonderful, famous people, I usually tell them that, really, thanks to Putin for this, because with the very academic Ryzhov, how else would I be able to connect with him in no other way except because of this mad person in power? And because of this, it's a paradox, perhaps, but we have to be thankful to Putin, at least for this. I think it's just part of your optimistic approach to life. Sasha, since you started speaking about your guest, academic Ryzhov, can you talk about your favorite guests and how do you guests talk about part of that process a little bit? It used to be difficult when nobody knew yours truly, and now it's much easier because more people recognize my name, and so when I just call and offer different people opportunity to answer questions, I always explain that we'll never cut anything out so that nobody says anything that some words were cut out. Even if we have 2 cameras or 3 cameras, we always keep the audio track, always keep it untouched. Whatever person says, that's what we keep. And many people find this almost seducing because right now the profession of journalist has been very much discredited. Moreover, Journalist. What is journalism overall in Russia? People have forgotten. They don't know. When I come up to people and ask them very elementary questions, such as, well, okay, the last show was, one of the last questionnaires was, do you feel the country is moving more in the direction of Europe or more in the direction of North Korea? People would bulge out their eyes and would ask, why are you trying to provoke me? And I would say, well, dear sir, this is my job. I'm a journalist. It's my business. This is my duty to ask different questions, including unpleasant questions and maybe even provocative questions. People have forgotten what it's like to be a journalist. They think that journalism is Solovyov or Kiselyov or Tolstoy. That's it. So the official propaganda. Yes, exactly. They long time ago forgot that there was a program called Vzгляд. They forgot that there was NTV. As they say, they've gotten used to the smell. And maybe in the past, 10 years ago, you could breathe. Let's say in our KGB closet, they were spraying some air fresheners. Now they decided to cut even on that. But, well, you gotta save costs, of course. But, it was admitted that this was harmful. Let people smell what really smells like a reality television. Yes, and people got used to it. Our television is absolutely impossible to watch. I've tried a few times, but after... I don't hear dialogues there. There's just hysterics. People are yelling at each other. The host behave in an absolutely unprofessional way. They interrupt the guest. That's not a host, because part of the host is to be above the fight. The part of the host is not to get in the way, to moderate. And here you have a host that takes a very specific position and they turn a guest into their own opponent, and they start arguing with them. They start interrupting them. It's impossible to watch. It's just hysterics. That's not a talk show. What about your opinion then about the other media outlets that remain in existence in Russia, such as Dozhd or others, Radio Liberty? Okay, I'm going to try to be very correct here and accurate, because much of what is done by my colleagues I absolutely do not like. First of all, Dozhd has censorship. Do you feel it is self-censorship or a censorship from outside? Both. First of all, Dozhd is not an independent project. I know this for sure. I just don't want to talk about it. I don't want to name names. Although, how important is it that they're independent? Oh, it's absolutely important. Independence is very important. You have to pay for independence. So if they're dependent, that means that there are certain themes that they do not discuss or certain names that they do not name. Absolutely. Yes. And here you have the self-censorship and the outside censorship blend together when you really want to invite someone, but you can't. It's that which propaganda man Posner does. He's like a predatorial fox. The person who always says, well, let's figure it out. I want to get to the bottom. I want to get to the bottom of this. Everything is clear. Everything to everyone is clear. But he wants to get to the bottom of it. What's there to... That's just propaganda. Don't do propaganda. The word that you use frequently, that I hear more and more often in Russian media field, lukavit, or dishonesty, or insincerity. You always ask people, why are you being insincere? It's in English, or perhaps a hypocrisy would be in English, or in double tongue, something along those lines. Insincerity, in other words. Why? And it's so polite. Why are you doing it like that? I try not to hurt my respondents and my people that I talk to, because I have an actor's education. It's easier for me to get in the skin of the other person, and I have a very highly developed sense of empathy. So when the person tries to soften the wording, just kind of get away from answering, not in a sense like it's a Zhvanetsky when he says he was beating his head on the wall for a long time. In other words, he got away from answering the question. No, these people, although some people are lying, obviously, just clearly, some people are just rebroadcasting TV talking points. But there are about 30-40% of people who are responding to my interviews on the street who are trying in very soft wording and soft phrasing to say one thing. I will not be saying is what they were trying to say, because there could be consequences. People have been really scared. The citizens really are afraid. And in fact, to me, it's very strange that these adults, aunts and uncles, Mr. and Mrs. what are they afraid? That the Beria and Stalin are going to come out of their graves and they will be taken away to jail? Most likely they're afraid to lose their work, to lose their jobs. They're afraid that an investigator from police will come to them, that they will have some kind of complications for their relatives at work. Well, but you're being watched by so many people. Who knows who will see it? And I'll tell you this. Me and my wife went to a store, and a woman comes up to me and says, "You, Sasha?" I said, "Yes." She says, "Oh, thank you so much to you from my husband and from... We completely agree with you in everything. Thank you so much." Very often people come up, of course. But if I come up to them, if I were to come up to them on the street with a microphone, it will be a completely different reaction. In 90 cases out of 10, because a person will be thinking not about thanking Sasha, but about what consequences there will be after that person will say, and tens of thousands of people will see it, including administration, president's administration. And I'm not overestimating our significance when I say that we're being watched in president's administration. I know this for sure. So that's why you're probably being thanked, that you're saying things that other people are afraid, don't dare to say. Well, yes, and for this too. For this also. I feel very sad. I regret that for this heroism, this is being taken just basic, the everyday human thing, honesty. This is being viewed as heroism. That's wild. Even in the most horrible nightmare, I couldn't imagine that this will be. Sasha, we kind of went through two themes, and out of both of them you went into other different, more interesting things, but I still would like to come back to them because I'm interested in your answer to those questions. So, for instance, who's your favorite guest? Oh, they're all my favorites. All of them? Like children? Yeah, I love them all very much. No, they're not children. They're very adult and very respected. And they're much smarter than me, much wiser than me. They, in front of them, I worship them. I respect them. The same Academic Rzhov. He's a legend. I very much respect Alia Hijakova, an actress. When I interview politicians, it's different. Not because I don't respect them. I respect them also. But I consider the politician as a certain caste of people. If I talk to Professor Zubov or Academic Rzhov, I try to have more human dialogue. But when I talk to politicians, I have to be harsher, because normal person, it's my personal opinion, shouldn't go to politics, because politicians, that's how they're made up. They try to promise as much as possible and do as little as possible, and to do so that they will be not very noticeable. That's their nature. Part of profession, I suppose. But it feels like in Russia it's particularly sharpened or perhaps dulled version. Yes, yes. You're absolutely right. But in my opinion, in Russia, there's no politicians left in Russia at all. It's a big problem. In Russian, there is no politics or politicians. There is groups of people who own all of the resources in the country, and there's a group of people that would like to replace that group of people and become those people. The last politician was murdered on Moskvarevsky Most a year ago. That was a real politician, a street politician, experienced politician, charismatic. And that was Nemtsov. Okay, fine. So what about Lev Schlossberg? Because I feel that he's also a politician in a good sense of the word. To my big disappointment, Lev Schlossberg, yes, a person could be mistaken. I would be very interested in speaking with him. Unfortunately, so far it hasn't happened yet, but I think that one day it will occur. I'll be able to talk to him. Lev Schlossberg is a very interesting person, but I feel that in today's times, in this epoch, he is doomed as a politician. He just cannot happen. He can't be realized. Well, the same way as Nemtsov, the same way as Navalny. Just part of being an opposition politician in Russia means that you will not be realized. Oh, I will not be a politician, says Sasha. When all of this madness is over, I have this dream of leaving politics, political journalism behind, and go back to writing. As far as Nemtsov, Nemtsov was a politician. He was in politics. He was at the very Olympus, and in that sense, he had a huge experience. He had good gut feeling, political gut. Of course, the other question is that sometimes it misled him, and at the end, more and more, arguments, fights, there were between everyone. He and I argued terribly, but I always respected him. Sometimes I couldn't love him because he was a politician, but I respected him tremendously. As far as everybody else, unfortunately, neither Navalny is not a politician. His team and what he does, I also very much respect. His anti-corruption investigations, that's journalism. His movie Chaika and other investigations, that's really cool what he does. That's wonderful. But I cannot call him a politician even with a stretch, because he makes such basic elementary mistakes. Sometimes you just kind of wave your hands, and maybe these mistakes were programmed, maybe this is on purpose. These mistakes are made. It's hard for me to judge. I'd like to speak with Navalny. Yes, I would like to. Why I haven't done it yet? Well, he runs away from me. Really? Oh, yes. He runs away. You have your questions are too serious? I have a series of questions that I would like to get some answers, but I'm not going to announce them here. But if Alexei Anatolyevich Navalny will be ready to communicate, I will with much pleasure do it. And as always, we will not cut anything out, and we will broadcast our conversation as a whole. More than likely, so far, he's not ready. Well, we'll be hoping. So when it will occur, it will be a big step, and all of us will know that something happened, that the current of the river has been reversed. Yes, most likely. Very well. Then I'd like to return to another question, that if you have additional information or your opinion, I'd like to hear it. The other media outlets, you said that Dost is a dependent channel. What about, there's independent people such as yourself, and I don't want to compare the genres, but there's Mr. Maltsev, who also has a large audience, sizable audience, and he's kind of independent. And besides that, there's Echo of Moscow, and what else? As far as Echo of Moscow, I'm going to be very harsh right now. Echo of Moscow became a dump. Mr. Venediktov, their editor-in-chief, who I very much, Mr. Piantkovsky calls him a mole. Mr. Venediktov did everything to destroy this once respected radio station. Thank you very much, of course, to his assistant, Lesia Ryabtseva, who very much helped. She fulfilled her contract. I don't know who it was with, who was the contract, but she fulfilled it wonderfully. A+. Mr. Venediktov turned this into a dump. It's possible to listen to certain things. For instance, Viktor Anatolyevich Shenderovich. And yes, him, I can listen to him endlessly. And a couple of other people. But then, on the other hand, maybe that is that insane price that needs to be paid in today's Russia to have so that Shenderovich could speak for 40 minutes once a week for some time, then that means that maybe there's a combination has changed, and now you have a barrel of grease with a spoon of honey. I told him, Victor, I understand now that probably there's a point for you to go there. I listened to his appearance on Echo of Moscow and the program of Special Opinion, and he very wonderfully spoke, and I said, yes, it probably makes sense for you to go. But even if they will invite me there, which though of course they won't never invite me, I would never go there. And he says, Sasha, you have to understand, the radio station is a hostage. They are hostage of their editor-in-chief. What can they do? Nothing. And so what happens, this propaganda approach, the worst kind, with 60-40, where 60% is truth, absolute truth, and 40% is lies, propaganda, and that's the very worst. It's a very powerful combination that kills and burns everything in its way. It destroys journalism. Maybe today's Russia, you can only have 95 and 5. Look at RBK, which is a business channel. About that channel, we'll have to forget. Well, maybe we can remember them for their past. Perhaps. They are now going to be doing, just trying to fight back and getting back the little islands of relative freedom. Because they must have it. First, they want to build North Korea in the information field. And once this people will get used to this North Korea in information field, then they can make it in real life. Of course, they won't be able to do it. You don't think? You think that this system will explode? You know, isolationism in 21st century is not possible. I mean, it is possible to some extent until money runs out, but then that's over. North Korea, it's impossible to build North Korea in Russia. Imagine yourself the territory of North Korea, and now imagine the territory of Russia. It's just by definition. That's not possible. And so, I think it's also not possible because of general history of Russia's inaptitude in being able to get anything done on a large scale. Let's not forget that North Korea, there's no breath of fresh air in decades, and we still had some. We had people who left. I mean, yes, 70% of the people in Russia have never been outside the country, but 30% have left the country. Should they all leave now? I think that more and more people are leaving. Well, again, you know, to count on the drunken electorate, to count on the very last, they're not able to create anything. Even under the whip, they'll just get drunk and they will not build anything. They will not march. Maybe they will march in a drunk way, and once in a while somebody will fall out of that march. Drunken citizens will collapse and will remain laying in the street on unplowed fields. This is not possible. At least I do not believe that this is possible. And for this, you also need idea. And what is the national idea? Is there in Kremlin's back pocket? Okay, let's not say that national idea is to annex something and run away. That's emotional. That's a gangster's idea. To run into a burning house of the neighbor, to grab your things and yelling, "This is mine, run out." Yes, something like that perhaps. But this is the idea of a gangster, the idea of a con man. But no, in no way this can become a national idea. North Korea has idea of Chechnya. We used to have an idea to build communism. So you will die, and your kids, well, more likely your grandkids, and for sure your great-grandkids, are going to live in communism. And communism is this thing that when you're born, and you already have everything. You already have your apartment, you already have a car, you already have a dacha, you don't have to pay for anything, from everything to their abilities and to each based on their needs. It's wonderful. You go to the store, as Grandma would say, and you'll have everything for free. That's a very simple, very primitive idea for understanding. That was apparent to any grammar. Well, maybe the national idea is step to the left, step to the right is viewed as attempt at escape? No. Such approach to the question, I feel that most people wouldn't agree with. So what do you mean they will not agree with? They will just quietly just die out? Well, there aren't that many of us left anyway. I mean, how much time is needed for this patience to just completely clean up, to just dig into earth? 10 years, 15, 20? This system will not be sustainable. Moreover, this crew of gangsters that are sitting in Kremlin, they don't have any crisis ideas. They don't have a crisis of ideas. They have a crisis of personalities. Just look, this vertical of power, that this stick that is standing in the middle of a dump. I'm not calling the country a dump. I'm calling the system a dump. And the stick stands there, and on the sign, Putin. Besides Putin, they have nothing. They have no one. Just look, out of this vertical of power, you can remove anyone. Yes, but in Cuba there was only Fidel Castro, and that was enough. Again, Cuba, let's not compare little countries with huge empire and huge country of Russia that has, with its historical traditions of rebellions. So you believe in history of some kind, that the history will protect? No, history will not likely will protect, especially since no one wants to learn historical mistakes, so we step on the same rakes. Well, yes, but it's the same rake. Oh yes, the rakes are the same. So even if they don't want to know the history, they still step on the same rake. Yes, if people are missing these history lessons, then the history will continue to repeat, only in different ways. But that means that, well, I don't know, but I mean, when Stalin was in power, it gotten pretty far towards North Korea, and so if it happened before, couldn't it happen again? Okay, there was an idea before, there was an ideology, of the communist ideology. There was Marx, Lenin, and Stalin. Again, if you look at the biblical approach, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Holy Spirit is Marxism, Father is Lenin, and Son is Stalin. So at least everything was very clear and lined up. And today, the vertical of power that is surrounded by corruptionists and gangsters, and there's just a sign, Putin, that's it. You can take out anyone, Rogozin, Medvedev, easy. Take out Sure, did anything change? No, nothing changes. Or there will be Pamfilova. It will be still the same madhouse. But if you just remove Putin on for the 16 years that all of this propaganda was working to better this image of this one person, if you talk to anyone in that system, they'll say that Chaika is a thief. Yes. And what about Putin? What do you have against Putin? Nothing. So this is the only hook on which the whole construction is being held up. You move away that Putin, everything will collapse, and no one will be able to substitute him. That's the thing. I'm not saying that he's a strong politician. He's not a politician at all. It's just, he's just an inflatable figure that's made out of nothing. I made him out of what was available, out of mud, whatever, but whatever I had at hand. And here it is, above us. As soon as he will disappear, everything will fall apart. Unfortunately, on our heads. And then, when the masses will find out the truth, when they'll find out the truth, they will be grabbing their heads, running around, and yelling, "We were fooled again." You're listening to 91.7 FM, WSUW, in Whitewater, Wisconsin. You're listening to Rashkin Report.